everyone. Welcome back to Into Battle with me, Simon Holland-Roberts, and my good friend Phil Baxter. We're sat here again in the Pig Pod down in sunny Mochra in North Wales, talking about all things Into Battle. If you haven't joined us before, I'm a bit of a layman in most things, and I'm kind of picking the brains of my good friend here, Phil Baxter, who is an enthusiast in all things military and battles. We touched on many things in the First World War, the Great War, on the last podcast, if you joined us. And this one, we're going to extrapolate a bit more into that with the theme of the old Contemptibles, which is a phrase coined by a certain someone during that time. So, Phil, if you'd like to you've brought more of your memorabilia with you now. So what have we got here? We've got, it's quite a famous poster, isn't it, from the time?
Yeah, it's good to be back again. It's next episode. The war started, as Lord Grey said, the Home Secretary said, the Foreign Secretary said in September the 3rd, the lights went out all over Europe, and we don't imagine they'll be lit again in our lifetime. So by the 4th of August 1914, after 37 days since the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, Britain was involved in the First World War, the Great War.
Right.
And it was a real sort of, it's very popular, ironically. It was a very much the expression of an imperial power that we should be up there with everybody else doing this. It wasn't so much anxiety and fear from people. There's popular support for it. Our boys, once again, being British and being brilliant. And this poster, it's a classic poster that people have seen of Kitchener, the "Your country needs you," the sort of sending you to recruit. And if I just flip it over to the other side, there's another sort of common poster there. But masses and masses of people joined the colours. The problem with this was that we didn't have the facility for all those people to go to war.
Right.
So we decided as a nation that we'd made some preparations. Have you ever heard of the phrase the Entente Cordiale?
Yes.
Yeah, this was an unofficial kind of agreement between Britain and France.
The cordial agreement.
The cordial agreement.
Yeah.
Nothing written down, no formal alliance, just a gentleman's understanding kind of thing that we would go to help France. And so we did. We sent the British Expeditionary Force was dispatched to the continent to support the French. Because remember, the First World War began from our perspective when the Germans invaded neutral Belgium.
Right.
But concurrent with that, they invaded their arch enemy, France. And they invaded France with 6 armies, each of, maybe 500,000 men.
So obviously Belgium and France are different entities. But were they affiliated that closely that it involved France anyway? Is that like
Belgium had only been in existence since maybe about 1820.
Right.
It was a creation at the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
Really, and Belgium was a neutral country.
Right.
Ironic, because Belgium has often been referred to as the cockpit of Europe, the fighting place of Europe.
Yeah.
Belgium was a neutral country, and Britain's involvement really was that we'd said to the Germans that you can't come through Belgium. You can't do anything in Belgium. And the Germans' plan was rather similar. Have you ever heard of a guy called Alexander the Great?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Alexander the Great's battle plans very often were based on an idea called the hammer and the anvil.
Yes.
So you would fix the enemy with your anvil and then wield your hammer in some sort of flanking attack and crush them against the anvil. So the Germans had decided they were going to invade France in their traditional way, as they'd done in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War. They would come through those sort of southern parts of the Franco-German border, pin the French army there, and then what would have been their right-hand flank, the Germans' right-hand flank, or the east up by the coast, they would swing through neutral Belgium and outflank the whole of the French army, and then capture Paris and defeat the French army in detail. The British Expeditionary Force was dispatched to France, ostensibly to protect Belgium, but to bolt onto that left flank of the French army to span the gap between the end of the French and the Channel.
Yes.
Really, that was ours. So we dispatched 120,000 men, 4 infantry divisions and a cavalry division.
Right.
And they went off to France to do our professional fighting.
Uh-huh.
Now, in the size of that army, and this is, I think it is so typical of us being British. The Kaiser, the German emperor, had decided that the British were not really a military threat on land.
Mm.
And immediately we say that, even today, people with that very strong patriotic kind of sense, how dare somebody say we're insignificant? But we were a very small army. You're looking at the French and the Germans having armies of millions of soldiers, and we've sent an army of 120, 130,000 men.
Right.
It's tiny.
Was that our army? No, obviously.
No, we had other, and they were originally, the original plan was to send 6 divisions,
Right.
but 2 were retained at home just in case of invasion. We didn't wholly commit.
Right.
The British position was we didn't really want to be involved in a European war. We even then we weren't particularly European.
Right.
We wanted, and our political and particularly military power rested on our massive navy.
Yeah, huge.
And we were sure we could probably prevent an invasion. We thought we'll keep a couple of divisions at home, as the phrase was used at the time. There is no military problem to which the solution is 6 infantry divisions and a cavalry division. Our army that we were going to send wasn't ever going to resolve anything.
Right.
But the Kaiser had told his generals, whatever happens, we're going to do this, whatever, but you must destroy that contemptible little British army.
Wow.
And so the British army was referred to as contemptible before it had ever got into combat.
Propaganda.
Yeah, maybe.
Saber rattling. I mean,
maybe talking up, rather like before a boxing bout.
Yeah.
Belittling your opponents or whatever. But the sort of the form book. If this was a horse race, the form book for the British Army wasn't that good.
Right.
We got battered in the Sudan. We got battered by the Boers. We'd just about beaten the Boers the second time we went there.
Right.
We weren't a massive continental army.
Right.
We were an island race with a very big navy.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
So.
And that kind of explain who the Kaiser is, because
he's the German emperor. Germany had
they're under an emperor.
Yeah, because Germany was a confederation of minor states.
Right.
Have you ever heard of a guy called Bismarck?
Yes.
Yeah, the battleship, the Bismarck.
Yeah.
Bismarck brought the German states underneath essentially Prussian power during the late 1800s, and that's how Germany came. And the Kaiser had become the emperor of Germany, rather in the same way as you would have had the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yes.
It's a collection of individual states, but amalgamated together into a single entry, a greater Germany. Germany, like I say, Germany's a political creation that didn't really. Britain's great, isn't it? We've got a defined wet, dry border called this coastline.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to see what Britain is.
Yeah.
Whereas Germany was a little bit more amorphous.
Yeah. So that's where we get the name.
Yeah,
the
old
Contemptibles.
The old Contemptibles was a name dubbed later on.
Okay.
But it started to be used in a different understanding based on what happened. So the British Army is dispatched to France and Belgium. It doesn't know where the German army is that it's trying to fight. Right. And the German army doesn't know where it is.
Right.
So the British Army is on the left-hand end of the French and British line, and the French are full of élan. This, we think the British are going to go up against everyone with cold steel.
Yeah.
The French had a three-phase tactical doctrine: attack, attack, attack. That's all they wanted to do. They wanted to get to the Germans and attack them. So they move forward. They attack the Germans. The Germans start winning,
right,
and the French start having to fall back. And so the first engagement the British really have is they go to a place, and we spoke about it in the last episode, a place called Mons.
Yes.
And they move up to Mons, and their job really is to protect the left flank of the French army that is next to them.
Okay.
So to prevent the French army being enveloped. Sadly, that French army gets pushed back, and it leaves the British a little bit further forward than they want to be.
Right.
And the British commander, a guy called Sir John French, ironic, French has been French being the commander of the British, working with the French, it becomes confusing. Yeah. So French talks to Lonzac, the French commander, and the French commander says, can you hold for a day,
right,
to give us chance to withdraw and form ourselves or regroup ourselves? And so the British commander says, yeah, we can hold, we'll hold at Mons. And so we fight the Battle of Mons, and it has this sort of fables, the Angel of Mons, which is a fictitious creation by the press, surprisingly. But the British they don't win at Mons, but they don't lose.
Right.
And the Germans they're shocked by their first encounter with the contemptible little army,
right,
because rather than just rolling over it, it actually gives them a few good slaps around the chops and stops them in their tracks,
right,
momentarily.
So is it Mons? Is Mons like a heavily built up area? Or?
It's a little bit like the Lancashire coalfields.
Okay.
At this time, it's a big coal mining area.
Okay.
And John French, the British commander, makes a complete, in my opinion, makes a bit of a goof to it. He splits his army into two components.
Right.
One component under a guy called Douglas Haig, who becomes the commander-in-chief later in the war, is on one side, right next to the French soldiers. Mm-hmm. The second corps, commanded by a guy called Horace Smith-Dorrien, and he's only been in post for a day because his predecessor had a heart attack on the train. The original two-division commander had a heart attack on the train, and so Smith-Dorrien was rushed out to help him. He defends, he follows French's instruction, he defends up against the Mons-Condé Canal, which if you considered it very swiftly, very sort of superficially, defending it on the edge of a waterway, that sounds pretty good. Apart from the fact this waterway is not the sort of canal that we have in Europe today, where it takes massive ocean-going vessels. Mm-hmm. It's a space of water about 50 foot wide,
right,
and maybe 6 foot deep.
Right.
So a German army getting across it's not necessarily the best place to defend, but they do defend it. They stop the Germans in their tracks, and the thing that really stops the Germans in their tracks is the British firepower, the British musketry.
Right.
In the previous episode we were talking about it. After the Boer War,
yeah,
the British had got to a point where they thought good quality musketry was really important.
Yeah.
And we have like 4 or 5 times the scaling of ammunition for practicing every year. Mm-hmm. And so the British marksmen, the Germans come on in big columns, which are, because the Germans are pretty much mostly reserve soldiers, they've been brought out of civilian life.
Yep.
It's easier to control them in big formations.
Okay, yeah.
Because they're not as well trained. It's not that they're poor soldiers, they just, it's hard to coordinate them. Mm-hmm. So they come on in quite densely packed big formations, and the British infantry, delivering their musketry, decimate them. They destroy lots of the Germans because, have you ever heard of a thing called the Mad Minute?
Nope.
Right, this comes from these sort of colonial wars. Like I say, Britain had a big empire. Mm-hmm. So the idea is you're fighting against a colonial opponent, and that opponent is about 600 metres away from you.
Right.
Yep. So they advance up to 300 metres. So from 600 metres to 300 metres, you shoot aim shots or possibly even volley shots.
Explain.
20 soldiers in your little group of men.
Yep.
Right, this section, 600 yards, 5 rounds, rapid fire, and they all fire together.
Right.
In big sort of groups.
Right.
Rather than firing individually.
Yep.
But your enemy get to 300 metres, and then they can cover 300 metres in a minute.
Right.
10 seconds for 100 metres if you're Jesse Owens, the sprinter sort of thing.
Yeah.
But 300 metres is a minute. So the British then say at 300 metres, rapid fire, go on. And they train all of their soldiers to be able to fire at least 25 rounds, aimed rounds, in 1 minute.
25? From
a bolt-action rifle, firing... 5-round clips, pushed a bit. It holds 10 rounds in the magazine. So you'd fire your 10 rounds. You'd have to reload with another 10 rounds, fire them, reload with another 5 rounds. But they practice, because they've got these 250 rounds a year, they practice until they're really good at it. Right. And what the British do is they pay their soldiers for being marksmen.
Right.
Yeah, they pay them for being marksmen.
They're big bullets.
303. Yep.
What does that mean?
7.62 millimetre diameter for the bullet head. So
right.
There's an example of a bullet head. I'll put that on there. Yeah, So that is 7.62 millimeters or 0.303 of an inch diameter bullet, made of lead, coated. This time they were just lead in the first part of the war, but later on they were coated with copper.
Right.
A little bit later on. But
so they're firing these rapidly.
Yeah. So
are they moving as well, or are they just in a line?
They'd be in a prone position. They'd be lying down or kneeling down.
Okay.
Depending on the terrain. Aimed shots, not just firing.
Right.
Aimed shots.
Aimed at a bloke.
So when they were training in the UK before the war,
right.
you'd go down. You'd be on the ranges. Like say Bisley and Surrey, they go 100 ranges wide, 100 spaces on the range sort of thing. So they go down and be on the ranges, and the shots would be measured.
Right.
And there's a British musketry instructor, and I don't recall his name at the moment, but he still holds the world record for aimed shots hitting the target. 600 millimeter wide target at 300 meters.
So like the size of a man.
Man-sized target.
Right.
He managed to get 39 rounds in the target within 60 seconds.
What?
Bolt action, 10-round, 5-round clip-loaded magazine. 39 rounds in 60 seconds on target.
That is mad.
So the British had this tremendous pride. My old regiment, the Cheshire Regiment, was renowned as being one of the best musketry regiments in the army. And everyone was a marksman. And if you're a marksman, as I say, you got paid more.
Right.
So it's worth doing.
Of course.
So the Germans come up against this, and they get smacked. They get slapped back.
Right.
So Dorian ends up having to retreat, comes back a few days later at a place called Le Cateau, where I visited a few weeks ago. They fight the Germans again, and once again, check them again. But they managed to keep holding the Germans off and holding them off all the way through this, what we would call the retreat from Mons, as the French are having to fall back, the British are having to fall back too with them to conform to them.
Okay.
There was a thought that the British might actually sneak off and go back to the Channel and go home.
Right.
But they didn't. The politics of it.
Yeah.
So come back to what you're originally saying. The soldiers who fought in that army then took it rather as an insult, being the contemptible little army. It was now a badge of honour.
Right, of course.
I was one of the old Contemptibles.
Right.
I was one of the original soldiers, all volunteers, because there were only volunteers in the British Army at that time.
Yeah.
All volunteers who stopped the Kaiser's dastardly fist. And you talk about propaganda, as the Germans advanced through Belgium, they were raping women, burning houses down, bayoneting babies. Whether this is true or not, it doesn't matter, but this was the propaganda.
Yeah.
So being part of the army that stuck it to the Kaiser was a real badge of honour.
Right.
And the British had introduced it during sort of their colonial period. They'd started to introduce campaign medals.
Right.
They started to try and build a little bit more about the esprit de corps of the army and tradition. Like as I said, my old regiment.
Yeah.
People had these traditions, and the first campaign medal that was awarded was this thing, the 1914 Star.
Right.
And it was, it's just a medal. About 150,000 of them were issued because there were only that many people who fought during that time. But it came with one of these things, a little bar.
Right.
That goes across the ribbon.
Okay.
And the bar says 4th of August to the 22nd of November. Because that was the award for that original army, that original campaign. And if you had one of those, that made you one of the old Contemptibles.
Wow. So
Men with that medal. And it's interesting because subsequently, a medal was issued for the 14 and 15 campaign.
Right.
Which was this one.
Okay.
Which, just popping it next to it, looks very, very similar.
It's a different colour.
That's just the patina. That's just the wearing.
Yeah,
these are both replicas. These ones,
okay.
But one of them's been aged a little bit more.
Okay.
But I'll explain now. Then I'll just point across it on the diagrams. In the centre of them, there's a little scroll, and one has 1914 on it.
Yeah.
And one has 1914-15.
Okay. Right. Right in the middle bit in there.
And so, if you see anybody who has this red, white, and blue ribbon tape,
right,
and they are soldiers who were fighting in 1914 and 1915. The Mons Star only at the very start of the war.
Yes.
The other one through to 1915, because at the start of 1916, the British introduced conscription.
Okay.
So anybody who has either of these awards
is
a volunteer.
And they were the first in.
They were the 1914 was the first in. They're the old Contemptibles.
Yeah.
But anybody with either of those
Or the first.
are volunteers.
Right.
Because in 1916 onwards, you have people being forced into the army. They're conscripted.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, and just while we're looking at the medals, just because it's topical, everyone who serves gets 2 medals guaranteed. They get
in the First World War.
Yeah, they get the Victory Medal,
Right.
and the British War Medal.
Right.
So you'll see soldiers with either 2 medals or 3.
Right.
If they have 2 medals, it's most likely they're conscripted or volunteered after 1916.
Yeah.
And it might be that somebody volunteered in 1916 because they'd only just become of age.
Yes, of course.
To serve.
Yeah.
So, but they will have those 2 events, and if they've served in 1914 and 15 and were some of the original volunteers, they'll have the 3rd one, and they were referred to as Pip, Squeak, and Wilf after comic characters of the time.
Right.
So.
Pip,
Squeak, and Wilf, or if you only get the 2 for the latter 2 part, well, Mutt and Jeff, which were also cartoon characters, and the medals were given these little sort of comedic names.
Good man, that's fascinating.
So I think it's like personally, I think it's like quite British, isn't it? That we have that disparaging term that then becomes an actor. I don't know if do you recall the TV series with Sean Bean, Sharp?
Yeah.
Where Captain Major, whatever rank he was, Richard Sharp, was referred to as a proper bastard, which meant he was a great officer.
Yeah.
But that use of negativity
you
as
bastard.
a proper bastard. He was a good soldier.
Yeah.
The downside of this, though, and this is once again
war.
no, there is a downside to this. There's it's a little bit of a fable. There's an element of plausibility, a bit of believability of it. The Germans came under had tremendous losses in this early part of the war, even through to later on. The map that we've got is a map of Ypres, and Ypres was another battle fought in 1914, which comes on to something we'll talk about in another episode. But the sort of fable is that the Germans believed, because of their mass casualties, that the British must have high numbers of machine guns in their infantry battalions. The British were actually scaled to have 2 machine guns per battalion.
Right.
Yeah. And it was the British marksmanship, their musketry, that caused the casualties.
Wow. So
the Germans think, well, do you know what we should do then? We should get lots of machine guns for our infantry battalions.
Right.
And so, and I don't know if this will be, it'll catch on the camera. You might have to pan out a little bit on the camera. This myth, the myth of the German machine gun, then becomes a reality. So later on in the war, and this isn't once again borne out necessarily by evidence, later on in the war, when the British are attacking German positions, the Germans have far more machine guns than they might have had
it not,
because they scaled up their firepower, because they realised that the British firepower stopped the German attack. So the Germans thought, well, if we scale up our firepower and have more machine guns, we can have fewer men stopping the attack. So we actually there's a bit of a thought that we
hoisted by our own petard.
Hoisted by our own petard, yeah.
Wow.
The arms race of the technology.
Well, it was all about that, though, wasn't it? Like any warfare is about that. It's about how the next step is always the best. But it's funny how it comes out of the fact that these guys were so good at their reloading and releasing at distance and in speed that they were fooled into thinking there was loads of machine guns.
They must have had.
They worked like a machine.
Their firepower, the British firepower, was so impressive. The only way we can kind of reconcile that is they must have.
And we looked at and that went back, that precedes the war. That goes to sort of the Boer War,
the colonial wars.
The knowledge of that they brought forward from those previous wars. They've gone right. We need this kind of.
Well, in the Boer War, the Second Boer War, it was still a prevalent sort of situation. The Second Boer War, the soldiers were obedient, and even to the point of soldiers being in combat and being under fire from the Boers. The Boers were in concealed positions firing, long range Mauser rifles, contemporary German rifles. They're not old weapons. They're are weapons of the time.
Right.
And the British are taking casualties, and British junior officers having to send runners back to a more senior officer to ask if their men could take cover. That's the level of obedience and discipline in the British Army, was that the infantry soldiers didn't even have the individual autonomy to take cover in the face of fire. Even just to lie down.
Yeah, all right.
They would stand in a line and get shot
because they're that obedient.
Because that's what they've been told to do.
God.
And they wouldn't fire unless they were told to fire.
And that's what you want. Is that what you want?
No.
Is that what you want as a soldier?
The British come back and go, this isn't working, is it?
No.
So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll train our soldiers differently. So they started training their soldiers in individual movement, and fire and movement in small groups. So even to the point of pairs. So you shoot at the enemy, and I will move to a new position.
Right.
I will then shoot at the enemy, and you can move to a new position. And this sort of leapfrogging, buddy system, and these tactics and the marksmanship came in with part of that. We want semi-autonomous soldiers who will react to the battlefield situation and do the right thing, because that's what they're trained to do. And the Germans didn't have that. The Germans were much more regimented because they had a lower level of training, but not. And I'm not saying that in any sort of disparaging way, because they were reservists. We had a professional elite army
ready to go.
They had masses of semi-trained civilians who could suddenly return to the colours and then form a credible, huge army.
Yeah.
And they did start to win at the very start of the war.
I remember the other day we were talking about something. Just to go slightly off piste. We talked about lancers, and that was quite fascinating, because talking about we sent cavalry in this first volley, I suppose, and they had guns on there. They had the same riflery as you would have your marksmen.
Yeah,
which was new, wasn't it? Relatively new.
Yeah, the continental armies had kind of derived from that Napoleonic period where the soldiers marched around shoulder to shoulder, delivering controlled volleys of fire under the command of officers. Cavalry charged other cavalry, and they did some reconnaissance and stuff like that. And that's where they come. The British, because of their colonial experience, and particularly South Africa, had changed their cavalry sort of doctrine.
Right.
And their cavalry, once again, the cavalry are usually armed with a small, like a sort of a kid's version of a rifle, a little bit short, called a carbine.
Right.
And it was, and the cavalry weren't really meant to use it, if you know what I mean. They weren't a firepower.
So are they using?
So lances and things.
Spears.
Once again, lances, big long spears, colonial, very good for stabbing
people on foot.
People on foot, tribesmen by it. And also, it's a part throwback to the sort of Indian cultural influence, the Indian Empire's influence, the Pathans and things, where they had cavalry armed with lances.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a throwback for them. So UK-based British cavalry units that had lances typically had some sort of linkage with India.
Okay.
Because that's where they'd learned it.
Okay.
Sort of thing. But no, the British cavalry are much more operated like the Boer cavalry had, where they were a mobile firepower arm. So in the First World War, there's a couple of cases where British cavalry have charged things, like at the Battle of Odrigny, once again the Cheshire Regiment, where the Lancers and the Dragoons charged the German guns, and surprisingly they just get wiped out. It's a disaster.
Right.
But the cavalry are much more like a fast insertion force, so like a helicopter assault in modern days. Yeah,
right. Okay.
We want to capture the wood at the top of the hill.
Right.
Send the cavalry up. The cavalry will get there and occupy the ground, and then the infantry will catch up and consolidate the position.
Right.
And the German cavalry weren't as capable at doing that.
So they were still. Were the Germans still using lancers?
Germans had lancers, yeah.
That just sounds. I mean, in your head, it just seems. I mean, it seems so recent, I suppose, because it is almost in living memory of our forebears. But my great grandmother died when she was 98, and she was born in 1898. So she lived the Boer War, First World War, Second World War, Gulf War, if you want to count that one, and Falklands and all. But in terms of, you know, to me that sounds just bizarre that you've got a fighting element of any army in my living kind of not my living memory, but my forebears' living memory, that are using big sticks. Which, you know, it seems so archaic.
Well, in 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, June the 15th, 1815, the French had cavalry called cuirassiers.
Right.
Flamboyant dress with a big silver breastplate, a steel breastplate, to protect them from musket balls. And it did protect them from musket balls.
Right.
In September 1914, 99 years later, the French cavalry still went to war with cuirassiers with steel breastplates and blue uniforms and red pantaloon trousers. And surprisingly,
because they were French.
And surprisingly,
why
being the sort of the pseudo-academic, that weapon system wasn't suited to the environment they were going into. Up against machine guns,
Mausers,
and shrapnel artillery. I mean, the steel breastplate didn't work as well.
I mean, there has been cases in history, obviously, hasn't there, in battles where you're just literally outdated. Like you turn up to a, you know.
Well, it is. It's a commonly used phrase that every army is prepared for the last war it fought, not the next one.
Yeah. I mean, we're digressing completely here, but if you think of like the samurai and the Last Stand and all that kind of cataclysm of like complete sort of generations just missing.
It is a slight digression, but I think it's of interest personally. But British Army recruits today, British Army recruits last year, would have had a 3-day module called The Realities of War.
Right.
And typically they would have gone to somewhere on the Western Front, and they would have visited the World War I cemeteries, and it would have been a time for them to reflect on the history and maybe of their regiments and stuff like that, but also on the realities of war, that there could be mass casualties and you could be one of them. And I know that isn't any longer part of the training budget for the soldiers, because we don't have the training time. I don't have the money and the resources to extend the training time, so it's been replaced by training on drone warfare and electronic countermeasures warfare.
Wow. Based
on the experience of Ukraine.
Of course. So is that where we're heading, do you think?
Yeah, so this thing about you always fight for always trained for the war that you've just fought.
Yeah.
It could be that Britain is now looking a little bit more forward and thinking the next war will involve these weapon systems. We've seen them being used and seen them being used to good effect.
Yeah.
We need to train for this.
Which obviously at the time in the First World War, the lack of that kind of pace outdid certain divisions in German divisions.
The First World War was never going to happen.
No.
You know, the First World War is effectively a massively militarized inter-family feud. Yeah, the royals of Europe were so interconnected with each other. You know, don't forget, at this time, the royal family was the Saxe-Coburg-Gothers. Yeah. And they only changed the name to Windsor later on because it was a little bit more British. You know, the Kaiser really was the king's cousin. Yeah. You know, and there were never going to be these huge wars between the British and the Germans and the French. And
that's how you used to do it, wasn't it?
It got out of hand.
Interesting. That's been fascinating. We've kind of covered a lot there.
Yeah,
and you know, we could go
peeled a few more layers off the onion.
We have, and we could go on and on, but we're not going to at this moment. At this moment in time, we're going to go on to our next podcast, and just to remind you that you would be in your best interest to like and subscribe to what we're doing. We want to see your comments, anything that you want to discuss with myself. Well, not myself. Don't discuss it with me. I'm useless. Phil's your man. He has got a wealth of knowledge, as we know, about everything British military, you know, all over the place. Thank you for being with us, and we will catch up with you very soon. And good luck in whatever you're doing. Ta-da!